Hi. So today I wanted to talk about the book by Lisa Feldman called How Emotions Are Made. And I wanted to start this as the first book in my series on a few neuroscience books that I want to read this year because I want to get a little bit wider on my knowledge and information on neuroscience books. So if you're also interested in reading more about neuroscience, philosophy, or psychology, I hope you enjoy these videos. So yeah, the first book I want to talk about this week is by Lisa Feldman, and it's called How Emotions Are Made. And I thought it was a really good book. Like, I gave it 4 stars, I think, on Goodreads. Yeah, so in this book, I will dive into 5 lessons or 5 ideas I got from the book. So emotions are used everywhere. We teach kids and psychologists with these standard emotions. Autistic people are trained using these emotions. Tech companies say they can read people's emotions nowadays using complicated AI algorithms, and they are even used during court. But years of research have shown that there are no such things as universal emotions. Not in faces, not in bodies, and not in the core circuits of our brain. So the first idea that Lisa Feldman delves into a little bit is the lack of a core fingerprint of emotions in our faces, bodies, and our brains. So in general, when we think of emotions, we usually think of certain emotional stereotypes in our faces. So for example, when we're happy, we would smile, or when we're angry, we would frown. But it has actually been shown that in natural settings, so settings outside, people don't really react like this. So when sportsmen, for example, are really happy, they sometimes also scrunch their face or look really angry. And sometimes when someone is really sad, they can actually look quite blank. So it has been shown that there are no such thing as actually universal emotions in the face. So the next myth she wanted to bust was to see if there are universal emotions in the body. So for example, you can imagine when your heart is racing and you feel your chest cramping, that could be a sign that you're really anxious. But she actually gives the example that a lot of women get misdiagnosed for certain heart attacks because they are diagnosed with having an anxiety attack. And this just shows that also the body doesn't really have a universal signal or universal fingerprint for certain emotions. So sometimes when someone is getting really angry, their heart rate goes up. But for other people, when they get really angry, their heart rate actually drops. And the last myth she wanted to debunk is that there's such a thing as a universal signal in the brain. And I was actually a little bit shocked by this because we learn, for example, that one of the centers for fear in the brain is the amygdala. So the amygdala is this tiny piece or tiny center in your brain that is usually related to fear, or a lot of studies show that it's related to fear. But she gives this example of 2 twins. So it's a pair of identical twins who lost the supposed fear-related parts of their amygdala. Both were diagnosed at the age of 12, have a normal intelligence, and have a high school education. Despite their identical DNA, equivalent brain damage, and common environment, both as children and adults, the twins have very different profiles regarding fear. One of the twin actually has fear-related deficits and doesn't experience much regarding fear, whereas the other twin basically has normal responses during fear. So it kind of shows that one of the twins doesn't have any related responses to fear, and probably her brain networks don't show up normally as would be for fear, whereas the other twin, her brain kind of compensates for the general fact that her amygdala is damaged. And this shows that there is in the brain not really one area that encompasses fear. It's actually different parts of the brain that work together that create the experience of feeling fear. So Lisa Feldman kind of goes into this idea of the Bayesian brain. So the Bayesian brain is the fact that our past experience shapes how we think of our future experience, or that our prior probabilities are updated by new data. And our prior probabilities is kind of the biases we have. So Lisa Feldman then says that our emotion experience is made up of the things that come from inside, the things that come from outside, and our past experience with certain type of emotions. So for example, if you're feeling your heart race and you're kind of sweaty, your outside experience is that you have a presentation, and you know from past experience that you get really excited for presentations, you probably would conclude that your emotion at that point is excitement. And I find this idea kind of interesting, that the emotions that you feel don't really have a ground truth, but it's more how you, from past experience, decide what your emotion is at that moment. And then the third thing she goes into is that language, culture, and emotion are then highly correlated. So she describes this disorder called alexithymia or emotional blindness. And this is a broad term to describe certain problems with feeling emotions. And it's also the Greek term for no words of emotions. And I thought it was a really interesting type of symptomology that I hadn't really heard of before. And I want to describe a little article that I read in the New York Times about a girl that experienced this. So it's called My Quest for Sadness. So the girl says the following: I had followed her into the bathroom and hugged her. I had known Aunt Lydia for 10 years. She had always been vibrant, beautiful and funny, but cancer was stealing her away from us. I understood cognitively that I was sad, but as was typical for me, I didn't feel sad. Rather, I felt matter of fact. And I think this case describes really well what people usually with this type of disorder feel. So they can recognize emotions from the outside and they know that what they are feeling is not appropriate for what's happening, but still their brain cannot conjure the emotion of sadness in this case. So Lisa Feldman goes into the fact that language and how we view emotion are then highly correlated and highly linked. So if we don't have certain words for certain emotions, we probably won't recognize those emotions properly. So for example, the difference between jealousy and envy, a lot of us usually mix these up, but they actually describe quite different emotional experiences.
Dad, you shouldn't be jealous of Apu. Remember, it's all about the music.
I'm not jealous. I'm envious. Jealousy is when you're worried someone will take what you have. Envy is wanting what someone else has. What I feel is envy.
Wow, he's right.
And also something that I then find really interesting is that in different languages you have emotions that are not there in English. So for example, in Japanese you have the word natsukashi. So natsukashi kind of describes this emotion where you're really fond of a certain past memory that has been gone. So when you look back on a certain memory, you get natsukashi for that memory. And I think that's an experience we have in English, but we don't really have the right words for it. Another one from Dutch that a lot of people always say is the word gezellig. And gezellig is kind of the word cozy, but you feel it when you're with friends or with family or in a certain situation. You feel really the coziness of being amongst friends. And that's the word gezellig. And there's not really a direct translation to English. And the last one I want to talk about is a word from Korean, which I think is such a good word that we don't have in English. And that's the word 답답해. And 답답해 is kind of this almost physical feeling that you feel when you're really frustrated, that it's almost suffocating. And usually it's used when someone is doing something really silly or really stupid and you're kind of feeling like 답답해, and you really feel it in your chest here. And I think it's so interesting when you learn certain languages that you will have emotion concepts for certain emotions that you cannot express in English. So the thing then that Lisa Feldman says is that we are architects of our own experience. So we are not only a passive observer of the things we're feeling internally and then describe them externally, but we actually have an active role in how we interpret the signals that come from the outside and come from the inside. So if you interpret something as stress or something as excitement, it's entirely up to you how you view the world and your experiences. So her last advice then is that you can actually master your own emotions if you're a little bit more aware of it. So I will go over some of the tips that she gives for mastering your emotions. So the first thing she says is that you need to have a solid foundation. So a solid foundation is usually for your body. It's just a really boring advice of eating well, exercising, and having plenty of sleep. The second one is also to have human touch. So for example, seeing a lot of friends, spending more time in good environments with a lot of plants, such as the outside, right? And the best tip she gives, I think, for having a solid foundation is adopting a pet. I really agree with this. A pet is a really good way to manage your body budget. And the second thing she goes into is to increase your emotional intelligence, or the words you have for your emotions. So emotional granularity is kind of how fine-grained your understanding of certain emotional concepts, may it be your own or other people, are. And people that have a better emotional granularity are usually better at expressing their emotions and also understanding the emotions emotions of others. So it's quite important to get new emotion concepts. And she says you can do this by reading books, for example, which I really love because usually there's not a good argument for reading a lot of fiction books, but getting new emotion concepts is a really good argument for reading fiction books. You can also do it by watching movies or in general being a collector of experiences that are not your own, where you're not the main character. And also one tip she gives, which I thought was really funny, is to invent your own emotion words for certain concepts. So if you're feeling something and there's not a word for it, just to make up your own words, which I think is really interesting if you're good at that. And the last advice she goes into is mastering your emotions at the moment. So usually it is quite easy to look back and understand your emotions, but sometimes you're feeling really angry or really frustrated and you just want to master your emotions in that moment. So she says to use your body, so like to go outside and exercise or to change location is one of the best ways to change the internal and also external signals for a certain emotion, and then afterwards to journal about it such that you can recategorize exactly what you felt and what you experienced, and you can kind of relearn some of the emotions. So yeah, those were all the lessons I read from the book, and I think in general it was one of the best books I've read in neuroscience so far. So I really recommend, if you're doing anything with neuroscience, to read this book, and also if you're doing something with psychology. I do have to say her last chapter went a little bit into the emotions of animals, which I don't necessarily agree with, and she also talks a little bit about consciousness, which I think is not really the place for in a book like this. Yeah, in general, I super highly recommend. And if you want to read a little bit more in neuroscience, I also made a little video about that here. And otherwise, see you next week with hopefully another book in neuroscience. Bye.